So welcome to another episode of the Wipro Chief Data and Analytics Officer podcast, where we take a look at topics that are closely related to the interest of CDOs, CAOs, and anyone in a senior position of data, governing its data and finding uses. I'm James Jeude, a member of Wipro's Data Analytics and AI team, and a founder of the Wipro CDAO Council. Today's topic is a look back at a classic IT problem intersected with a very modern situation, which is namely chargebacks and return on investment. We'll be returning to the problem of ROI, that is, a complex environment where chief data officers really need to guide and drive the conversation on how many departments are involved in managing, qualifying, and using data, and many departments are getting the benefit. It's no longer a simple case where a department can choose on its own to make an investment and get a return and make the decision themselves. So the problem statement is that ROI does not always have a single beneficiary, nor does it have a single investor who's suffering the pain and cost. I would argue that, in fact, most modern business innovations, pretty much all of them are multi-departmental and multi-stakeholder. So we're here today to talk about the challenges with these three experts, so I'll have them introduce themselves in a moment. Then we're going to jump into unpacking the problem of the return portion, the investment portion, and what happens in a complex environment. So Doug, why don't we start with you since you're in the top right corner, introduce yourself, and then we'll move on to Arka and Jennifer.
Wait, I'm in the top left corner.
Oh, okay, on my screen.
I don't. So James, great to be with you. Thanks for the invite. Most people know me as kind of a long time now recovering Gartner senior analyst. While I was there, I formed the Chief Data Officer Research and Advisory Group. Currently, I am independently advising data analytics and AI executives on strategy, maturity, organizational operating models, and data monetization and evaluation approaches. I also teach a class on infonomics, which we'll talk about a little bit here, at the University of Illinois' MBA program, and exec ed classes for data analytics and AI executives at Carnegie Mellon and MIT. For fun and to get kind of new ideas off my chest, I write in Forbes and Chief Data Officer, CDAO Magazine, and some other journals. And the most exciting news is that late last year I moved to Portugal. So, boa tarde.
Yep. And Arka?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, James, for having us. That was really nice meeting you. My name is Arka Ray. I am one of the managing directors at the Data Economics Company. I am a computer scientist by training. I was doing my master's in distributed systems and distributed consensus when I got recruited by Microsoft to come help launch the first version of the Xbox Live network back in 2005, 2006. I spent about 6.5 years at Microsoft, first on the architecture team, and then on the games and games platform development team. And then I left to start my first company that was in the consumer media space. Learned a lot about how to go direct to consumers there. I exited that to a couple of my large customers back in 2018. And that is when Jennifer and I started doing the research that eventually led to the Lydian Software and the Data Economics Company, which is I got very interested back in the day on, we were seeing a lot of innovation around the idea of distributed consensus in the domain of cryptocurrencies specifically, which was interesting. But what was much more interesting is we had suddenly arrived at a standard where we could now exchange pure data for real value. And for both Jennifer and me, that opened up a lot of interesting use cases and outcomes that went way beyond just the new type of currency to actually thinking about data as a new type of reusable, renewable product. So that's what we've been doing for about 5 years now, primarily in the pharmaceutical space, in the climate tech space, and in the gaming space, which is kind of where my background lies. And I will hand off to Jennifer to tell her part of the story here.
Thanks, Arka. And as you mentioned, the pharmaceutical space, which was a bit of a teaser for kind of my background. So quite a different background, I think, than the rest of the folks on this call. But I trained in health economics. So I trained at the London School of Economics. I am very interested in the intersection between data, finance and economics, and in any stripe and pricing and the value of data and measurable outcomes. So I'm actually continuing my academic work. I'm working on a PhD at Oxford right now. But as Arka mentioned, when we first came together, it was kind of an aha moment for me because of figuring out, wait a minute, we have all of this data in the pharmaceutical world. We're trying to figure out how to link that data up with economics. And you're telling me that the same thing is happening in video games. This is like two different worlds colliding, so we must be onto something here. But prior to getting into this, I spent a many number of years in the big pharma world at Roche and Genentech, which probably a lot of folks know those companies, kind of household names now. I also spent a number of years in management consulting for the biopharma industry. So I've seen a lot of different use cases of data when it's gone well, data when it's not gone well. And in that industry, data has a massive impact on value. And I think we're just starting to scratch the surface across all of healthcare and the life sciences and understanding kind of how to better leverage data, not only for like the core things the industry does, you know, discovery of new medicines or improving health outcomes, but for a lot of other things in terms of efficiency, in terms of linking, you know, payments to outcomes, to data, really some transformational stuff. So as Arka mentioned, that's kind of where we came together, and we've been cranking on this idea of data economics since.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing some real life examples. And in pharma, I know from my own experience, you know, one of the industries I covered, that's a classic kind of case where it might be some core research, which is expensive, disproportionately benefits one therapeutic class. You know, do they own it, or could another therapeutic, you know, the company's paid for it, can they use it? But then who paid for the research? They may not have done it just for themselves, and it gets more and more complicated. So let me make a pivot then to that very topic, which is, you know, ROI has been well understood, you know, for years, return on investment. And, you know, when I was getting an MBA, a lot of it was around, you know, what is the investment? What's the cost of goods? What's the, you know, the hurdle rate and all that sort of mathematical stuff. I don't think people are terribly worried about that anymore. The real question is the value is almost always something that benefits multiple people, and the cost itself is also spread across multiple people. And it gets into a game of bluff, or you have a very benevolent board that pays for everyone. We've seen that in the case of, you know, AI. Recently, for example, the head of AI at Ernst & Young talked about how corporate paid for all AI for 1 year until everybody got addicted, you know, and then they had to pay for their own. But that takes a real vision, you know, to not try to cost share. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but let's talk about the value. Fundamentally, if there's no R on the ROI, it doesn't matter what kind of sophisticated, you know, capsules you have to track value and track cost. And Doug, you've really devoted a good part of your career to that, and more recently with Data Juice. And you spoke to our council last year. Some of the listeners may recall that. But tell us how companies identify those points of value. And I'm focusing here on data value. Obviously, there might be a value to opening a store or closing a store. But let's talk about data and innovative uses of data. If the value is not there, we don't even want to bother tracking the cost. And tell me about the complexity. I really want to focus on those cases where lots of people get a value, but lots of people have to join in. Any thoughts on that in your reading and your research?
Well, first, thanks for the plug on the book Data Juice. So, and yeah, many people can benefit from data. And in fact, one of the things that I found in my research is that organizations that are more data-driven or data, even data product organizations, have a market-to-book value ratio that's nearly 3 times higher than the market average. So there's something about the economics of a data business or a data-driven organization that investors favor, even if the accounting practices still don't allow you to recognize data as a balance sheet asset. One of the kind of the main principle of infonomics is that, you know, a lot of people say data is the new oil, and while that may work at a macro level, you know, data is a driver of the economy today. The way that oil was or has been the last century, but it misses the point that data is a non-depleting, non-rivalrous, progenitive asset. It doesn't get used up. It can be used multiple ways simultaneously. And when we do use data, we're typically creating more data that is potentially valuable. And so the companies that are winning today are the ones that are capitalizing on those three economic principles of data, whether it's part of their business model, whether they kind of have been explicitly thinking about that or not. So Data Juice is the second book in the series on data value. Infonomics was the first one and really lays out how to manage and monetize and measure data as an actual asset, including patterns of data monetization, formal valuation methods. We'll talk about that in a bit, and how to apply true asset management principles and practices to one's data assets. So Data Juice was prompted by clients wanting more inspirational stories than I had published in Infonomics. It includes 101 real-world examples of organizations in every industry and geography, implementing high-value or innovative solutions with data analytics and AI. So now I have actually over 1,000 such stories, and I've trained a digital twin chatbot on them, which I make available to some clients and my students. So I did a meta-analysis on these stories, and certain patterns emerged. So the patterns of generating value from data fall into indirect and direct data monetization. The indirect methods are about things like improving process, reducing risk or improving compliance, developing new products or markets, building and solidifying partner relationships. The direct data monetization is really more about bartering or trading with data for non-cash commercial considerations like favorable terms and conditions, enhancing products or services with data, licensing raw data directly or through data brokers or marketplaces, aggregating data into insights, analyses, and reports. And then there are a couple of kind of fringe ones. One is a lot of people say you can't monetize customer data because of privacy regulations, and I just think that shows a lack of kind of innovation and breadth of thinking. If you flip that model and say, listen, I can't sell you my customer data, but I can sell your stuff to my customers and make money or revenue or benefit from that in some way, that's what I call inverted data monetization. And so that's a pretty popular way to monetize customer data now. And then we're also seeing some companies starting to assetize data on their balance sheet via special corporate structures, taking their data and digital assets, moving them into a separate holding company, valuing that business, and then including the value of that business on the parent company's data sheets.
Yeah, so your Infonomics dream finally comes true there. Yeah.
Right. So a variety of ways to, you can also use data to secure loans. And so there are about a dozen or so kind of key patterns to generating value from data. And I'll share some examples later if you like. But let's hear from some of the others. Yeah.
And we're going to get back to the question of who paid for that and how did they decide the sharing, because that's really the premise today. But I appreciate that. But Jennifer, I know when we spoke last, you had talked about some definitions of how value is created and identified. Like Doug said, it doesn't expire. It kind of expires, but it accumulates and all that. Do you have any thoughts when you're talking to your customers or what you've encountered in your consulting on what can make data value and data-driven innovation different? And then we'll get to the cost side of it and how we can allocate that fairly. Jennifer, you're on mute.
Oh my goodness, rookie error. James, this is a great point, and I honestly think that this, in light of AI, and I would say there's an insatiable demand on the enterprise side right now to kind of do an AI transformation of their businesses that really at core is a data and kind of digital tech transformation of their businesses and figuring out how to better harness their data. And I think, to not sound, I hope, too repetitive with what Doug said, the value of the data so often is maybe not in the eye of the beholder, but in the utility and the use of the user and how they best figure out how to apply it. And I'll just talk briefly about like what we're seeing in the biopharma industry. There are folks that are figuring out how to apply data in super innovative ways, and then there are other groups out there that I think because of so many of the concerns around like privacy and compliance and confidentiality of data, which are very real concerns. I'm not downplaying those at all. But they're a little more skittish on what they can do to use data to kind of unlock new value for the companies. So, I think about a couple examples of just how that industry looks at data value, and I think there's still not a consensus across the board. Doug, I was really interested actually in what you just said about the holding company structure, because I hadn't heard that, although I've talked quite a bit about assetization of data and like the lack of gap standards in this area, and it's something that we kind of have very passionate discussions about. But if we just look at some acquisitions in this space, because I always think that's a good, market example and how this has changed over time. So we look, Roche bought a company called Flatiron for $2 billion a number of years ago. That company really was a data company. They had a lot of essentially electronic health record data, primarily on cancer patients. So, valuable to Roche because of the areas they develop drugs in. Although now they're considering, as of last year, I think, divesting that company. So this was a while ago, maybe 7-8 years ago acquisition. I'd have to double check the exact year. On the other hand, we have just recently announced Regeneron bought 23andMe, which had, kind of failed, but they had all that data still. Apparently they had not only the data, but the actual biospecimens that you could run to get more data out of them with more sophisticated machines now. That acquisition was $256 million. So, just pennies compared to what that other one. So they might have way underpaid, although I think they were maybe the best bid out there. And we all know, there's like macroeconomic stuff going on. There's not a lot of cash right now in the biotech markets for a number of reasons we can talk about. But what I think is really interesting here is that these acquisitions kind of underpin what value does the market think applies to data, and what's the value today, and then what's the value tomorrow of more data that we might get out of it. So to kind of tie that back to what Arka and I have been thinking about for a long time, and it's not just about how you put data on your balance sheet, but if you really want to think about what's the value of data to your company, you have to think about all the different ways that your company might use that data today and in the future. And it is these kind of direct and indirect ways of extracting value out of it. I think that we can also look at, when we think about like distributed systems and like big data analytics, and now what's possible across not only LLMs, but all of these advancements and things like zero knowledge proof. It's not just your data, but it's other data that your data might get aggregated with. And then how do you figure out how much of the value coming out of that is attributable to your data set or your entity? So, these questions start to get bigger and bigger. So maybe that was a long way to say, James, it's very hard to tell you exactly what the value of any data set is, because there are all of these different factors involved. It's no wonder that this has kind of been a very thorny issue for accountants and finance teams to grapple with.
Yep, and the theme I'm hearing is that it's not the data in isolation. I mean, if you begin to track, I don't know, product failures, that helps the warranty department, integrate with product design. Do you make it stronger and less warranty? Do you make it thinner and save money on materials? That's classic engineering that I grew up in. But it's the integration of the data. So we don't have to be precise, but clearly that gets then into complexity because you now have multiple stakeholders. So I'm going to pivot right now, and then we'll get to some real life examples after this next section on the cost side. So I'll start off with a little bit of my taxonomy. I think in terms of, as I'll mention repeatedly in this podcast, in a complex world, there's multiple people involved in anything that's valuable. Even if you have a new marketing initiative, it really comes from knowing, the warranty claims, the quality of the product, the demographic data. The finance department knows about, people that have overstretched or have capacity to upgrade. It's no longer a single decision on marketing to just run an ad. We see that across the board. We could talk for an hour just in those cases. So where does that data come from? To me, I think of it in three ways. So part of it is shared data. And there's a one-time problem and a continuous problem. The burden of regulatory and quality expectations, how do you set those? It's non-trivial to even know what it means to be compliant with, sovereign AIs and GDPR versus California and Canada and Brazil. We won't solve that in this call, but it's expensive. Then there's the ongoing cost. Every day, every week, there's a feed from your suppliers, let's say, or a feed from your researchers. Then there's shared analytics. Now, with ChatGPT and vibe coding, it turns out that the cost of data science and data scientists that we thought was going to be huge 10 years ago is not really the problem. You don't have to know data science in order, you just have to know whether it makes sense or not. I won't pound on that too much. And then I think it's interesting too, is that a lot of my clients are talking about building a custom LLM or SLM, a small language model, that's precision fit to their company. There's a language of art to legal, there's a language of art to, biotech, and you can't just take an LLM that read Tolstoy and French novels and Dickens and expect it to understand the language of a doctor. That is a non-trivial expense, and everybody has to pitch in with documents. And then, of course, there's the one-time architectural burden of building a modern data warehouse and data system, and then there's the continuous cost of keeping it up to date. So cost has all these phrases, and that's where I'm really interested in, because my CDOs are being asked to maybe take on an extra burden with no budget, or they're being asked to tell other people to do extra work. So how do we pick that apart? How is the cost of some of these innovations done? Is that all behind the scenes and we don't see it? Have you been involved with the Lydian product? Or Doug, when you were coming up with Data Juice, did it just drop down from heaven that the company agreed to do X and here's the value? Or was there, sausage being made that we don't want to see, to use the old phrase, right? How does that come about? Let's just chat a little bit about examples, and then I want to do a whole section on examples and sharing.
So I can't name names, but speaking of the pharma, so I've worked with a couple of global pharmas and to help them value and cost their data assets and data products. With one of them, they wanted to know what data should they be moving into their data lake based on the cost versus probable future economic value of the use cases that they've laid out.
Yeah.
So on the cost side, we looked, of course, at the cost, and we broke these down further, but the cost to acquire the data, the cost to administer it, and the cost to apply it. And there are various costs there, and that I lay out as part of my models. The second one, we looked at the net asset value of key data assets and then extrapolated that across all their data assets to, one, light a fire under the business to do more to generate value, come up with more use cases to grow the numerator side of that net asset value equation, but then also to make the business case for the denominator. Why should they be spending so much on governance and storage and cloud and metadata and master data management? Why is that important to spend on the denominator side or to help reduce the denominator side? So, without getting into the details of the models, as Jennifer said, there's really no one standard way to do this. So I've kind of adapted the 6 basic valuation models that I published in Infonomics for specific client needs.
So before we get to the Lydian perspective, Doug, do you find that there's a complex negotiation to decide, yes, here's, we're all going to suffer and we're all going to benefit, and then the company pays? Or does that still break down into a distributed cost, both ongoing and one time, and distributing annoyance and distributed, I'm thinking in terms of gaining kind of stakeholder agreement. So the enthusiasm continues years after the decision.
Yeah, the basic idea is to turn your data center from a cost center into a profit center.
Value
and so
center,
that requires, a lot of collaboration between the business and IT and data to come up with how that is going to work. And every organization is different, has a different culture, has different internal financial funny money number handling procedures. So there's really no way. One thing I haven't seen lately is chargebacks. So I just don't think that's commonplace anymore. And I don't know, maybe Jennifer and Arka have seen it, but I just am not seeing that the last decade or more.
That's sort of classic. Yeah, and I grew up in that era where you paid computer resource units anytime you typed in a line of code.
Yeah, I mean, you do see with the cloud vendors now. So the cloud vendors will charge you based on based on utilization. So, at some point, somebody's got to pay for that inside the organization.
Yeah. With the Lydian method of tracking value, do you also find, Jennifer, that people track cost that way? Or is that a question that makes no sense? I mean, in a sense of once you can track something, I'm curious how that's worked for you and your clients.
Yeah, James, I mean, we're a bit more zoomed out, I think. So, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about here is kind of the finance and economics of the firm. And I would say we're a bit more zoomed out in the context of how we think about helping enterprise look at their data sets and then identify those measurable outcomes that where your data is sending a digital signal for that outcome achieved. So, I mean, I think your question is really, really interesting. There are certainly many inputs that can be tracked in that data economic system and with the technology that we've developed. But we try not to be prescriptive in saying that input had a specific, price or cost associated with it. That's really up to the market to value, or in this case, it might be up to the participant or the firm to value. So Arka, I don't know if you want to chime in a little bit on that, and we can kind of get into what our philosophy is, which is a bit, as I was saying, more like zoomed out from this, but maybe we can zoom out a little bit and then like kind of bring it back together where these concepts meet.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll chime in. So as Jennifer said, there's some kind of two ways of looking at this. There is looking at data as a macro product, and that's kind of like looking at it as a tract of land, which you are just looking at as a whole. You're renting it out, you're leasing it out, you're selling it. There is also a way to look at the tract of land as Doug put it, as a reusable, renewable resource that can keep generating outcomes and outputs for you. So it can produce crops for you. It can produce minerals for you. Those things can then be used to create new products. So if you chain this up, what you're seeing is your land is basically a raw material that's producing outcomes that can then generate outcomes and outcomes. Now, if you take any kind of outcome, there are two interesting things about it. One is you can put some amount of scarcity to it because there's a certain amount of resources and energy required to produce any outcome in the real world, whether it's growing crops, selling a drug, playing a video game, or pretty much any industrial activity. Now, if you can take that outcome and cost it, and the smaller the outcome, the more contained the outcome, the easier it becomes to cost it. Then you can, that's kind of basic economics. You have cost, and then what is that outcome helping you produce?
Can I ask, why does a simpler outcome affect the ease with which to determine the cost? I'm not following that.
It's the ease of determining the inputs, basically, or where that derived from.
I see. Okay.
So if you have one data signal, sorry, Arka, go ahead.
So for example, if we wanted to take a complex blended data product, actually, let's take a simple example, like a coffee shop loyalty card, right? If I look at a coffee shop loyalty card and say, what is the value of this coffee shop loyalty card? There are many different ways that you can potentially construct the value of that loyalty card. However, if we start breaking it down into what are the outcomes that were required to produce that loyalty card, then we can see that, okay, let's say that the contract between the coffee shop and the customer is that I'm essentially going to buy 10 coffees and I'm going to get an 11th one free. So the first time I buy a coffee, I'm given this card with a little X on it that says, okay, you've bought one coffee. Now, the value of that particular atomic outcome of that transaction is probably relatively easy to figure out. There's the price of the coffee, there's the price of the goods, so on and so forth. Now, every time I purchase a coffee, I get a new X on my card. And then when I get the 10th X, suddenly that card becomes a data-backed asset. Now, what's interesting is every X on it actually has a lot of context embedded in it. If I had to prove that I had actually bought that coffee, that X represents both the customer's receipt, so the customer's proof that they did something, as well as the coffee shop's accounting system entry saying that I bought this coffee. Now, the X is a blended proof of all of those different sets of data that has been reduced to that one X because the parties have agreed that that is the representation that they are satisfied with. Now, once I get that 10th X on my on that card, it actually becomes a data-backed asset. Why? Because now I have taken that flat piece of data and injected some utility into it, which basically means that I can now transact that coffee card and get a coffee in exchange for it, which basically goes back to the earlier point I was making, which is there's a number of atomic outcomes that are relatively easily costed that have now come together to create a new outcome. So the customer gets new value in the form of a coffee card, in the form of a new coffee, and the shop potentially gets longer term value in the form of additional business. Now, an example that Jennifer will probably give us is we use exactly the same principle to help negotiate and adjudicate very complex contracts between pharma companies, insurance companies, and hospitals, let's say, in the EU, where each of these folks have data that literally cannot leave the silos that they live in for various business reasons. But they want to adjudicate a contract that requires that data to be adjudicated in order for that outcome to be adjudicated. So what these parties are trying to do is something very similar to the coffee shop card, where they're trying to create a data-backed asset that has the blended data from all of these parties that will help us produce a result. And all the parties involved in the contract will agree that that data has the cost and has the value that was agreed upon in the contract. So if you take that simple principle that we talked about in the coffee card and start thinking about it as, okay, there are all these tracts of land with raw materials that can give us some atomic product that can then be blended and blended and blended into more and more interesting products, then you have a provenance going back all the way to whose land did that raw material come from. And on the other side, you have a fairly mathematical way of saying, okay, these are the outcomes that were created, what was the cost of these outcomes? And now this blended product, what are the new outcomes that it can create? And what's
that makes sense. And
this gets even more complex.
Go ahead.
Just quickly, this gets even more complex when you consider that the blended inputs are also used for other products as well. So how do you allocate the cost of any given input across the range of, call them data products or revenue generating or expense saving activities, gets really, really interesting and complex.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Because in some cases they might be producing the data only for that, agreed extra value. In other cases, it's a byproduct of something going on, let's say in the factory, and it's just a question of cleaning it up and and sending it as opposed to creating it. 2 quick points, Arka. I love the land example.
Yeah. I'm sorry, but just
to, go ahead.
To wrap that point up with where Jennifer started, that's where we find that LLMs can be extremely interesting and useful, which is going out there and looking at all these different tracts of land and saying, you know what, if I got that data point and that data point and that data point and combine it together, I have a market where that will be valued. That is like, basically it's going to take an analyst, like we were imagining 5 years ago that we'll have data economic analysts sitting and looking at basically these feeds, trying to put it together. But that's where I think LLMs are so good. It's not so much about creating the synthetic version of the data that can be utilized, but creating potential, imagining these data-backed products that could be created, and then giving companies a recipe to say, okay, here's how you need to assemble the raw material to put that product together.
I like that. We've jumped into the example section, which I wanted to pivot to, and I will make a rather arcane reference. Many of my listeners know about a third of my books behind me are economics, a third of the space program, and a third are South Pole exploration. Plus, I have boxes and boxes up in the attic. But setting that aside, I love the David Ricardo, if you're familiar with one of the classic economists from the 1700s. And that was his point, was why is land sort of more valuable as it's closer to the castle and less valuable as it's further out? And, why is a Starbucks in Grand Central Station, paying more rent than a Starbucks in the middle of Ohio? And you really hit on that same example. So we won't beat it up.
I wonder what he would think about data being a substitute for land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, the 4 factors of production, or maybe even introduced as its own 5th factor of production. But we'll save that for another podcast.
Yeah, I think I do actually want to get some economists on as well and talk about chief data officers, which is the point of this conversation, managing the economic expectations. So I'm going to start my section on the examples with a quick example that some of the listeners heard. And it really isn't data, but it strikes me as a human nature problem. And I've seen this play out in my long career. There was a large liquor distributor and manufacturer that we were working with, and they wanted their route drivers in Europe to make note of competitive pubs that were opening up on the street. This is before Google Maps, and all this stuff was, sort of instantly captured. And basically, it would have helped the marketing department immensely, but the route drivers and the manager of the route drivers had an incentive, which was how many visits per day. They had no incentive whatsoever to take even 1 second of their time and do market research. Strictly speaking, you could say, well, the company benefits, we all work for the company, we all have the, hallelujah, let's have a group hug. But in real life, that doesn't work. If you're being beaten up, can I do with 1% fewer drivers and save the money? You don't want them pausing to take notes. I'm fascinated by that problem because it gets into something that's good for the company, bad for the individual, but you really don't want to set up a complex feedback where marketing pays part of the truck driver's salary. So that's examples that's sitting there. I don't know how to solve it, but it gets into human nature. So, and these examples, though, for a chief data officer who either has to bear the cost of increasing the complexity of a modern data warehouse and all of its governance, or asking business partners to do more work to get stuff ready for the warehouse. Nobody wants to spend money. Nobody wants to spend the time. They're all being asked to cut. And yet the company needs that to happen. How do we break that dilemma? And I'm going to give one example from a chief data officer I know who just told me this a few weeks ago. But let's start with all of you. Any thoughts on how do you get around that problem? Or is it a problem? Does everybody agree that, yes, the company benefits, we're innovative, we're valued 3 times more, Doug, like you said, because we're a data company, so don't break the model. Is it a problem? Is it a not? And if it's a problem, how is it solved? Do we have any recommendations for my CDOs?
Yeah, so I run workshops on this to generate use cases. And so we take a few different approaches. One is, I like to share examples. As I mentioned, I collected, 1,000 plus inspirational examples, which can either inspire or shame businesses into doing more with their data. But a lot of those examples will say, well, that's not in our industry. Well, why don't you take this idea and be the first one in your industry to do it, to adapt it to your own business? We can also show organizations how underutilize their data, how the cost of their data is greater than the economic value that it's generating. We can also generate prototypes. We can look at the range of data assets that they have and conceive new data products. So a lot of different exercises that I go through with clients to help them generate and then assess these use cases. And I can share some examples later if you like.
Yeah, Doug, I mean, we've similarly done exercises with customers to help them figure out like what is my data valued at? How can I make that argument to the folks above me about how much they need to invest in essentially invest in our data assets so that we can get more out of them and so that we can see that that return, but to justify kind of the investment story. But I think this speaks to kind of a bigger problem. And if I'm zooming out too much again, let me know. But there are not really fantastic price finding mechanisms or market mechanisms around data. And this ties back to what we were talking about. It's hard to put data assets on the balance sheet. It ties to what Arka was mentioning earlier, that we do have other examples in the economy where digital data packaged up in a certain way has a market. And the example there, which is not one that we necessarily think is one that a lot of enterprise should be involved with, but you look at what's happening in the kind of cryptocurrency, stablecoin, all of that kind of Web3 digital asset market. And there are markets and price finding for essentially digital, bits and bytes. But
and there are marketplaces for other kinds of data assets.
There are
various industries,
marketplaces for data, but there are, data is bought and sold. Now, how publicly findable and how standardized those assets are I think we still have a really long way to go. That's what we've been really trying to figure out and help solve for with putting kind of consistent looking technology container wrappers around data assets in various, granularity. And Arka, maybe you want to chime in here because you have that.
Jennifer, actually, I was going to ask you to maybe go into a little bit more into the example that I mentioned around how we've helped pharma companies and insurance companies adjudicate complex contracts using this, high-level model, because that's also a really good example to what James was talking about.
I think that is
basically an intractable problem.
I think that is a good example. So if we think about it, and I'll give everybody a 2-second health economics lesson here, but if you think about giving a patient a drug, a medicine, drugs are seen as intermediate goods because you can give 10 patients that drug and it might work for 5 of them, it might work for 8 of them, but there's no guarantee it's going to work for all of them. So you can't really buy and sell health. We can only really buy and sell these intermediate goods. I can't go out to the grocery store and buy 25 units of health. But I can hope that if I buy like some healthy food that down the line that might be a good
probability. Yeah.
Yeah. So we see a hugely increasing interest in the biopharma industry to be pricing more based on outcome rather than pricing based on the input. But the system really isn't set up that way. So the way that we kind of get around the system not being set up that way now is through innovative contracting types that look something like maybe warranties or guarantees, or if the patient gets better, I get paid X. If the patient doesn't get better, I pay you back Y. So just to give an idea of some of those formats for folks that might come from outside the industry. And so while this is all great in theory, where we see it get really challenging and down to the nitty gritty is when you have to sit down with that insurance company and that pharmaceutical company and say, all right, we've got all this data. What signals in the data correspond with patient doing better? And it's amazing that people that spend their life in this data, you'll hear crickets in that room. And you really have to prod people to start to think about, all right, what data is signaling that the valuable outcome happened or didn't happen? And it's definitely possible to define. We have all those signals in the data. And that leads me to the next question, or I guess it's the hypothesis that if that data is showing me the patient gets better, and I have an insurance company willing to pay, however we define patient gets better, and I have an insurance company willing to pay, let's say, $100,000 if that patient gets better, that's a signal to me that that underlying data is worth $100,000. I mean, it's not, not a direct line, but that's, I think, one really interesting way to look at data economics as what is the economic value of the outcome this is enabling. And then we can get into really interesting conversations about, like, is it really worth it, or is it underpricing or overpricing to say $100,000 in that situation? That's up to maybe the market to decide. But the signal can really clearly come from the underlying data that's contributing to that. But for having that data, we would not be able to adjudicate that outcome.
And just to build on that for a moment, and this tying back right to the beginning, what James said around the problem of data sharing and the problem of data availability. All of the contracts that we have helped adjudicate so far, none of the data has had to be produced specifically for adjudicating the contract. This was all exhaust from all of the different businesses that we were able to essentially package and combine in a way where that central product that comes out of it is the outcome of the contract. And that, to Jennifer's point, has defined market value. And as soon as we have that consideration, we can now start breaking the accounting back all the way back to, okay, what did the hospital contribute? What did the insurance company contribute, et cetera, et cetera. And to flip it around, if you can show that end product, then everyone suddenly has an incentive to share that data in a managed way, which is the first biggest hurdle we all have to overcome. Is like, how do you convince the companies, the CEOs and the board, to make it a mandate for the CIOs and the chief data officers to say, yes, it is a goal of the company to find new utilities for the data this company is already producing. That the data sitting there in this thing is not just exhaust for like audits and analytics, but it can actually be new lines of revenue. That is, I think, the switch. And once people get that, like just like with AI and LLMs, we're going to see quite the windfall. But it's and I think that's why people like us, it's important to have these discussions.
I think that reminds me, one of the chief data officers I've spoken with recently of a major telco, one of those giant companies, discovered that really what she needed to do was to gain a consensus and a story around where the value was, and then go to corporate and get them to fund it. It was good for the company, so the company paid. But that's when you have the ear of the board, which she did. And that's when you have a data-driven company. I can think of also a manufacturer. One of my clients a few years ago at Wipro did not have a data-driven company. They still basically saw their job as running factories, even though everything's CNC and controlled and you're optimizing shipping and all that. It was her solution was to build a case, but then have one person pay, single payer, if you will. In other cases, you have that constant chargeback. I want to pivot though back to what we can recommend to chief data officers, chief analytics officers, even the CIOs and CTOs that are building these complex, costly data environments. The warehouse that lets you really understand consumer sentiment is much more complicated than the warehouse that keeps track of orders and names and addresses that we had 40 years ago when I started. What would we recommend, the three of you as experts, for chief data officers to take away from this conversation, and chief analytics officers, and what should they do differently on Monday morning?
Well, go ahead, Jennifer.
Doug, go first, and then I'll chime in. No, please.
What comes to mind is we've talked about measuring data in different ways. So let's kind of break it down a bit. If we're going to treat data as an actual asset, which seems to make sense, given that we're in the midst of the information economy, or maybe we're at the beginning of it. Who knows? Marvin Minsky, father of AI, once said, "We're in the 1,000 years between no technology and all technology," and you can listen to what the experts say, but remember that we're all ignorant savages. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah.
There are formal ways to value any kind of asset. There are three main methods. There's the cost approach, the market approach, and the income approach. And so for the cost approach, we need to identify the inputs, as Arka and Jennifer talked about. How do we understand those inputs? Where are those inputs being used across a range of different data products and allocate them accordingly? It's a bit of an art, not necessarily a full science to do that. Then on the value side, what are these data products or data assets generating in terms of value? Revenue generation, expense savings. But then we can also look at it, again, as Jennifer was mentioning, we can look at the market value of a data asset as well. What would others pay for access to that data or data product in an open arm's length marketplace? The challenge there is data is this reusable asset or product, and you're not really, I think as Arka mentioned this, you're not really selling data, you're licensing it. So the monetization model kind of has to, the market value model has to be modified a little bit. Then there are non-financial ways to value the economic value of data. We'll get into that perhaps another time. But if we focus in on those three main ways to value a data, to value any asset, the cost approach, the market approach, and the income approach, I think we're headed down the right track. And then you're going to start to get your CFOs involved and say, you know what? Maybe this makes sense for us to help understand the denominator and numerator side of this. Maybe it helps us to understand the premium value for our organization based on the value of our data assets over and above, our book value. So there are a lot of benefits that can happen from this. So.
Yes, but Doug, that's great.
Yep.
They do everything that Doug said. I fully endorse all
and
of
there's
that.
more.
And
but
also,
there's more.
But wait, there's more. I've seen instances where companies, because of, for example, a regulatory firewall between the scientific part and the business part of a pharmaceutical company, didn't realize both of those groups were spending $1 to $2 million a year on a subscription for the same data set. And then doing all kinds of great analytics on that data set, but not sharing them. So if you are in that chief data role, you've got to go kind of talk to your people and understand what folks who have no clue about data other than the data vendors coming to them and telling them, or they have a little clue because they have some data scientists doing analytics. They know what they want to get out of the data, but they don't necessarily understand the dynamics of the data market or how to purchase and all of these aspects. Kind of roll up your sleeves and like have a lot of conversations with those folks, and there'll be a two-way educational stream. But I bet the chief data officers will find out a lot more about what folks in the trenches in their companies are trying to do with the data and what answers they're trying to get out of the data, because I also see a lot of folks buy data sets that don't actually give you the answers that you want because they're the wrong data sets for the question being asked. And these are all different competencies, right? So I think helping kind of educate and upskill your folks around data analytics, the value of that, have all those conversations, and then kind of get a lay of the land of what data your company's producing, what data your company's buying, and what all of that data is being used for. This sounds like really simplistic, but it's actually very rare in my experience to see an enterprise that's done that work to actually know, hey, does somebody have a list of all the data sets we buy? What are the costs of those in a year? Somebody has it. The CFO might have it somewhere, but it's not the CFO, the CEO, and all of the data users within the company aren't necessarily talking. So that would be one of my main recommendations on top of what Doug said.
Yeah, and Jennifer, what I've noted too is data literacy, ironically, has increased the complexity and the self-serve. You know, you may not even know as CIO that somebody's buying a data set that's redundant.
Yeah,
because they've got their own sense. What I'm really hearing is both
James,
from this conversation from. Oh yeah, go ahead, Arka.
And just reinforcing what I said earlier, which is, and again, this is what we are very passionate about, which is both the examples we gave of the simple coffee shop thing as well as the more complex medical contract, pharmaceutical contract. In both these cases, the data was already available. There was no added cost other than organizing the data to actually getting these additional outcomes and additional value. And I think that every chief data officer, every CIO needs to start getting excited about that because they understand their data, their company's data better than anyone else. And they can look into the crystal ball and see, okay, what is the utility? What's the future market utility? To Doug's point, what are those end products that the market's going to recognize and have income that I can start preparing my data to be the input for? Because the technology to be able to actually create these blended products and create mass markets for them is basically here. It's not even around the corner. So
it's kind of you can create new menu items to revitalize a restaurant with things you already have on the shelf.
With things you already have.
And then use that success maybe to branch out into new things. So
exactly.
It comes down to
it has been rotting in your fridge, and then suddenly it's 20 years later, everyone wants that cheese. So So it's the same thing with AI, same thing with all these transformational technology. If folks are actively thinking about that and making that a part of that charter, when that wave really starts cresting, they'll be in the prime position.
So the CDOs, CAOs, and other data governance and data platform people listening to this, I think really what you probably know is you have to lead these conversations. You cannot chase them. And you certainly, if you find out that someone's agreed to, let's say, combine marketing, sales, and shipping data into a new item for a new insight, and you're told, here's the requirements, that's really bad to be brought in at the point the decision was made. So find the value, and the cost sharing will follow. Companies, if they really want to do something, will find a way to make that happen. I appreciate the three of you joining. I think I might like to check in a year or so and see if we have some updates, because especially with the cost of LLMs and with the cost of, AI training is a new wrinkle. It'd be fun to check back in and see how this is going. But with that, I'd like to go ahead and close out and thank you all for your time.
Thank you, James. Arka, Jennifer, great to hear about your awesome work.
Thank you, Doug. Nice meeting you. Thank you, James, for having us again. Truly appreciate it. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Bye.
Have a great day.